Welcome. Before we get into this heartbreaking story, tell me where you're watching from and make sure to subscribe, because a lot of work went into uncovering the true events recorded in this plantation diary. This isn't just a story about slavery, it's about the personal tragedies, broken families, and the devastating choices that tore loved ones apart, all recorded in chilling detail by someone who witnessed it firsthand. The diary's discovery was nothing short of remarkable. Hidden away for decades in the attic of an old Southern home, the fragile leather-bound book had gone unnoticed by historians and descendants alike. Its pages were yellowed, brittle, and covered with the delicate, looping handwriting of someone who had clearly taken care to record daily events meticulously. When scholars finally came across it, they realized immediately that it offered a window into a world rarely captured in such personal detail. Unlike official records, which often reduced enslaved individuals to mere numbers, this diary told the story from the perspective of someone observing the intimate lives of these families, the small moments of joy, the unbearable grief, and the relentless fear that hung over every household. The entries began in the early 1820s, long before the Civil War, offering a timeline that spanned decades. Each day's note, no matter how brief, was loaded with significance: who had worked the fields, who was ill, who had received a visitor, and most painfully, who had been sold to another plantation. What made this diary particularly chilling was the casual way in which the sales were recorded. A single line could describe a mother being taken from her children, a couple separated for life, or a child being sent hundreds of miles away, and yet the diarist would write it matter-of-factly, as if noting the weather. This juxtaposition of normalcy and horror highlighted just how normalized these acts of cruelty had become. Researchers who studied the diary noted that it included more than just names and dates. There were descriptions of the family dynamics: parents whispering to their children in the dead of night, siblings clinging to one another during inspections, and moments of fleeting happiness stolen in stolen afternoons. These details revealed the humanity behind the records and made the enormity of the separations all the more real. Some entries even hinted at the mental toll on those forced to watch their loved ones taken away, describing sleepless nights, silent sobs, and the quiet resignation that became part of daily life. The diary also provided context for the decisions made by plantation owners. While modern readers might assume that the sales were purely financial, the diarist's notes suggested that favoritism, fear of rebellion, or even personal grudges often determined who would stay and who would be sold. This added a layer of unpredictability and terror. Families never knew if the next day would bring relief or devastation. Some entries describe frantic last-minute attempts by parents to hide their children's toys or warn them of what was coming, moments that ended in heartbreak as authorities overruled every effort. Beyond its immediate horror, the diary served as a bridge between generations. Some entries recorded letters sent from distant plantations detailing the health or whereabouts of children who had been sold. Occasionally, responses from enslaved parents to these letters were included, showing their determination to stay connected despite impossible odds. These fragments of communication offered insight into the strength, ingenuity, and resilience of families struggling to maintain bonds under a system designed to destroy them. In short, the diary was more than a historical document. It was a testament to the lives that were lived, stolen, and remembered. Its discovery reshaped the understanding of daily life on plantations, not as a series of faceless transactions, but as deeply human tragedies that rippled across generations. The details preserved in those pages allowed historians, and now viewers like you, to feel the weight of each separation, the grief of every parent, and the silent endurance of those who continued to hope in the face of relentless injustice. The diary goes beyond mere names and dates to reveal the heartbreaking reality of families being sold individually. Time and again, it records children, parents, and siblings ripped apart, sent to distant plantations with little chance of ever reuniting. The entries capture the physical and emotional toll these sales inflicted on everyone involved. One line might casually note that a father was sold downriver, but between the lines, the anguish is unmistakable. Mothers left alone with younger children, children screaming for the parent they could no longer see, and siblings reaching out for each other as they were dragged away. These moments weren't isolated. They were part of a terrifyingly systematic routine that reinforced the absolute power of the plantation owners and the fragility of family life for the enslaved. What's particularly shocking is the level of precision with which the diarist recorded these separations. Not only did the diary list who was sold, but it often included their ages, who they were leaving behind, and sometimes even the prices paid for each individual. This stark detail highlights the way human lives were reduced to property in the eyes of the owners. The juxtaposition of routine bookkeeping with the deep personal suffering it caused is jarring. One entry, for example, lists a young girl being sold for $70, while noting her mother's desperate attempts to shield her from the auction block. The words are matter of fact. Yet the reader can almost feel the tension, the pleading, and the heartache that accompanied every transaction. The diary also shows that children were not spared the trauma simply because of their youth. Some were as young as 5 or 6 when separated from parents or siblings. The diarist recorded their cries, their confusion, and even their attempts to cling to loved ones as overseers tore them away. These entries provide rare insight into how early these acts of cruelty began to shape the psyche of enslaved children. One page describes a boy who refused to eat for days after being separated from his older brother, while another recounts a little girl hiding under a bed in the hope of staying with her mother, only to be dragged out by force. The diary doesn't sugarcoat these experiences. It presents them with raw, almost unbearable clarity. Another critical aspect revealed is the ripple effect of these separations. Parents and siblings were left with the constant fear that any moment could bring another sale. The diary describes sleepless nights, whispered warnings, and silent prayers as family members tried to prepare themselves and each other for the next inevitable loss. Some entries even describe attempts at resistance, mothers hiding their children, older siblings sneaking messages to one another, or small acts of defiance during inspections. Yet, these attempts were often futile, and the diarist notes the crushing disappointment and sorrow when plantation authorities overruled every effort to keep families intact. The psychological impact on those sold is also chronicled. Many entries mention children being sent far away, sometimes hundreds of miles downriver, completely isolated from anyone they knew. Letters, when they existed, were slow and unreliable, leaving parents and siblings in agonizing uncertainty. The diarist occasionally documented fleeting reunions, brief glimpses of family members brought together at the mercy of auctions or sales, only to be torn apart again. These glimpses, though rare, highlight the deep yearning for connection and the resilience of familial bonds despite unimaginable oppression. Finally, the diary offers a stark reminder of the cold calculation behind these sales. Plantation owners made decisions based not on compassion but on profit, inheritance, or personal convenience. Families were divided in ways that ensured maximum financial gain or the preservation of control over the remaining enslaved population. The diarist's detailed account of who went where and why reveals a horrifying efficiency. Each act of separation carefully documented, as though recording it would somehow justify it. But within these entries, the human cost is impossible to ignore. Every sale represents a life disrupted, a bond shattered, and an innocence stolen. A truth that resonates far beyond the pages and lingers long after the diary is closed. The diary makes it painfully clear that the emotional trauma endured by enslaved parents was one of the most devastating consequences of families being sold apart. Each entry paints a picture of heartbreak and despair, capturing moments that official records would never record. The silent tears shed under the cover of night, the whispered prayers for safety, and the desperate hope that one day, perhaps, their children or spouses might be returned to them. One page recounts a mother sitting by the fire, holding the small blanket of a child who had been sold that morning, rocking herself back and forth while murmuring the child's name over and over. The diarist noted her pale, hollowed eyes and the way her hands trembled, documenting a grief that was both constant and all-consuming. The psychological weight on parents was compounded by the complete lack of control over their lives. Decisions about who stayed and who was sold were made entirely by the plantation owners, leaving families powerless to protect one another. The diary captures the quiet desperation of parents who tried everything they could to cling to their children, hiding them in corners, attempting to bribe overseers, or begging for a delay in sales, only to watch their efforts fail. In one particularly harrowing entry, a father is described as being forced to say goodbye to his eldest son, who had been his constant companion in the fields, all while holding back screams so that the overseers wouldn't notice his grief. The diarist's attention to these details underscores the unbearable tension that filled every moment of the parents' daily existence. The diary also reveals how parents carried the trauma even when their children were still nearby. Many entries describe mothers and fathers who, while present in the same household, lived in constant anxiety over the next sale. They would monitor the plantation meetings, overhear whispers of auctions, and react to sudden inspections with fear, knowing that any day could mean permanent separation. One particularly haunting account notes a mother waking in the middle of the night to find her child missing, only to discover he had been taken to another part of the property under the pretense of chores. Though the child returned later that night, the terror she experienced left her shaking for days, an invisible wound that never fully healed. Beyond the immediate fear of sales, the diary shows the lasting psychological toll on parents who had already experienced loss. Many entries reflect on the compounded grief of watching multiple children or family members sold one after another. One mother lost her eldest daughter early in the diary's timeline. Then, several years later, had her husband sold to another plantation. The diarist records her silence for days afterward, describing her grief as an unending shadow that refuses to lift. These accounts reveal a chronic, cumulative trauma, an emotional weight carried silently, made worse by the absence of any support system or legal recourse. Interestingly, the diary also touches on the small acts of resilience parents found to endure their circumstances. Some entries describe mothers teaching their remaining children songs or prayers that included the names of the siblings who had been taken. Others recount fathers sharing stories of family members' strengths and courage, trying to preserve a sense of identity and hope even in the face of unbearable loss. The diarist noted these moments with a quiet reverence, as though acknowledging that even amidst terror and grief, these small acts of love were a form of resistance. What makes these accounts particularly chilling is the diarist's impartial recording of them. There is no overt judgment in the text, only a detailed chronicling of events and emotions as they occurred. This matter-of-fact tone makes the emotional trauma feel even more profound, highlighting that for the enslaved parents, this was a daily reality, a relentless cycle of fear, hope, grief, and despair. It's impossible to read these passages without imagining the raw anguish of parents forced to endure such cruelty while powerless to protect the most important people in their lives. Finally, the diary offers insight into how these traumatic experiences shaped family dynamics over time. Parents who had survived repeated separations became cautious, protective, and often silent about their pain. Older children grew up bearing the weight of loss, sometimes attempting to shield younger siblings from the same suffering. The diary notes the ways these coping mechanisms emerged organically, forming a complex web of emotional survival strategies, a testament to the strength and resilience of enslaved families, even under the most inhumane conditions. In essence, the diary doesn't just document names and transactions, it captures the very soul of parental anguish, a silent testimony to love and loss under a system designed to erase both. It preserves the human stories that history often ignores, making the emotional trauma of these parents impossible to forget. The diary makes it painfully clear that the plantation owners held absolute control over the lives of those enslaved, deciding who stayed, who worked where, and who was sold, often with little or no explanation. Their decisions were guided by a mix of financial calculation, personal preference, and the desire to maintain authority, leaving families trapped in a constant state of fear and uncertainty. The diarist recorded numerous instances where a child or spouse would be sold simply because the owner deemed it convenient, or to settle a debt, or because one family member had displeased them in some minor way. The casual cruelty of it is almost staggering. One day, a mother could be tending to her infant, and by the next, the child might be sold to a distant plantation, never to return. The diary also reveals that the motivations behind these sales were rarely straightforward. While money was often the primary factor, owners sometimes made decisions based on their perceptions of loyalty, behavior, or even aesthetic preference. One entry notes a girl being sold, not because of her labor value, but because the owner wanted to separate her from a boy her age, whom he considered a bad influence. Another describes a father being sold to a different plantation, allegedly because he had spoken out during an inspection, though the diarist suggests that underlying tension and personal grudge were likely the real reasons. These accounts show that the choices were arbitrary, capricious, and devastating, reinforcing the constant instability in the lives of enslaved families. Interestingly, the diary captures the calculated way owners ensured that their control extended beyond the immediate sale. Families were not simply separated. They were scattered across multiple plantations, sometimes hundreds of miles apart, making communication nearly impossible. In some cases, older children were kept with one overseer, while younger siblings were sent elsewhere, ensuring that no parent could maintain influence over their entire household. The diarist records how these decisions were often framed as business strategy. Owners believed that separating families would prevent rebellion, discourage attachment, and increase dependence on the plantation itself. In reality, these strategies inflicted unimaginable emotional pain, leaving scars that lasted generations. The role of the owners is also evident in the way they manipulated the remaining family members. After a sale, parents were often forced to continue working in the fields under the same overseers who had taken their loved ones, facing constant reminders of their loss. The diarist recounts moments when plantation owners would call families together to witness sales, forcing them to endure the trauma publicly. Some entries describe parents clutching their remaining children tightly while trying to shield them from the sight, only to have the overseers tear their arms away. This orchestrated cruelty was not accidental. It was part of a deliberate system designed to enforce submission and maintain control. Moreover, the diary shows that owners sometimes used emotional leverage to manipulate those who remained. Parents were threatened with further sales if they disobeyed orders or failed to meet labor expectations. One entry describes a mother being warned that her eldest child would be sent to another plantation if she did not work quickly in the cotton fields. These threats created an environment of constant anxiety, making the enslaved feel powerless not only to protect their loved ones, but also to maintain even the smallest degree of normalcy in their lives. The diarist's records reveal how the psychological tactics of control were as devastating as the physical separations themselves. In addition to direct sales, the diary highlights how inheritance practices and property disputes often dictated family separations. When an owner died, enslaved families were treated as property to be divided among heirs, sometimes resulting in children being sent to entirely new states. The diarist notes that these divisions were often accompanied by arguments between heirs over the value of certain individuals, reducing family bonds to matters of negotiation. These moments underline the brutal reality that for plantation owners, the humanity of enslaved people was irrelevant. They were assets to be bought, sold, and allocated at will. Finally, the diary sheds light on the chilling way owners justified these actions to themselves. Entries occasionally hint at a sense of moral rationalization, owners claiming that separating families was necessary for discipline, productivity, or the supposed betterment of the enslaved. Yet, even within these justifications, the diarist captures the undeniable suffering inflicted, showing that no amount of rationalization could erase the pain of mothers and fathers, the trauma of siblings torn apart, and the long shadow of loss cast over generations. The record leaves an undeniable truth. The fate of these families was dictated entirely by those in power, and every decision, no matter how seemingly small, had a profound and lasting impact on human lives. The diary doesn't just document the cruel mechanics of family separation, It also preserves the fleeting, fragile expressions of resistance, hope, and despair that coursed through the lives of those enslaved. Interspersed among the ledger, like entries of sales, labor, and punishment, are moments that reveal the extraordinary resilience of human spirit in the face of relentless oppression. Letters and notes, sometimes hidden in corners, whispered between family members, or carefully passed along to trusted neighbors, became lifelines that allowed enslaved families to cling to each other, even when forced apart. These fragments of communication are some of the most haunting and illuminating parts of the diary, offering a window into private worlds that owners could never fully control. One of the most striking examples is a letter written by a mother to her child after the boy had been sold to another plantation. Though she could not send it herself, a sympathetic worker secretly passed the message along. In the brief lines, she reassured him that she loved him, that she remembered his favorite songs, and that he must stay strong and faithful. The diarist notes the incredible risk involved in sending such messages. Discovery could have led to severe punishment. Yet the mother persisted, showing that even under constant threat, the bonds of love were unbreakable. These small acts of defiance, carrying messages, hiding belongings, or sharing memories, were a form of resistance. Proof that the enslaved refused to surrender their humanity entirely to the cruelty imposed upon them. The diary also documents subtle, everyday forms of defiance. Parents taught children coded songs and stories that contained warnings, advice, or hope for eventual reunion. Older siblings would take on the roles of protectors, comforting younger children who were terrified of being sold. The diarist records one heart-wrenching scene in which a sister sang lullabies to her brother, weaving into the verses the names of other family members who had been taken away, creating a map of memory that connected them across miles of forced separation. These acts of preservation were critical because in a system designed to erase identity and relationships, remembering one's family became an act of rebellion. Despair is also vividly captured in the diary. The diarist recounts nights when mothers and fathers sat alone, mourning silently, unable to cry too loudly for fear of attracting the overseer's attention. Some entries describe adults rocking empty cradles, whispering prayers for children they would never see again. Others depict enslaved individuals walking for hours to search for a lost family member, only to be turned away or forced back by plantation authorities. In these moments, the diary portrays grief not as abstract, but as tangible, heavy, and relentless, a weight carried daily, shaping the psyche of the entire community. Yet hope endured alongside the despair. The diarist records small victories. A family reunited briefly through an unexpected transfer, a clandestine message confirming a child's well-being, or a parent secretly teaching a skill to a child before they were sold. These instances, though rare, highlight the incredible resourcefulness and courage of those enslaved. Even in the face of overwhelming systemic oppression, they found ways to assert agency, to communicate, and to maintain connections with those they loved. Each note, each whispered word, was an act of defiance against a system designed to strip them of all ties and identities. The diary also preserves observations about the subtle ways hope shaped daily life. Some entries describe laughter among children as a fleeting rebellion against fear. Others note that parents would quietly celebrate birthdays or small milestones in secret, creating moments of normalcy in otherwise impossible circumstances. These glimpses into ordinary life amidst terror are a testament to resilience, to the human instinct to nurture, protect, and maintain a sense of continuity even when the world around them seeks to destroy it. Furthermore, the diary emphasizes the collective aspect of hope and resistance. Neighbors and extended families would often band together to share news, relay letters, or protect each other from immediate harm. The diarist notes that these networks were not just practical, but also psychological, sustaining a sense of community and mutual care that strengthened morale and reinforced the bonds of family, even when physically separated. The very act of remembering, recording, and sharing stories became an essential tool of survival. Ultimately, the letters, notes, and whispered messages documented in the diary reveal that while the system sought to dehumanize and fragment families, it could never entirely extinguish love, hope, or the will to resist. Each communication, no matter how brief, secret, or precarious, represents an enduring assertion of identity and connection. The diarist's meticulous recording of these moments transforms them from private acts of survival into powerful historical testimony, ensuring that the stories of courage, defiance, and love under unimaginable oppression are remembered. In this way, the diary does more than chronicle tragedy. It captures the resilience of the human spirit, showing that even in the darkest circumstances, enslaved parents and children found ways to sustain hope, resist erasure, and assert the bonds of family, bonds that no system of cruelty could entirely sever. The long-term consequences of families being separated on plantations were profound and echoed across generations, leaving scars that extended far beyond the immediate pain of separation. The diary makes it clear that the trauma was not contained to the moment of sale. It reverberated throughout the lives of those who remained, as well as those who were sent to distant plantations. Parents and children struggled with a constant, gnawing uncertainty, never knowing if they would see one another again. For those who survived, the experience created lasting emotional and psychological wounds that shaped the way they raised the next generation. Some parents, for example, became overly protective of the children who remained with them, fearful that any moment could bring another devastating loss. Others were consumed by grief, unable to invest fully in the lives of their remaining family members, leaving a void that children carried into adulthood. The diary also illustrates how separation disrupted the transmission of culture, knowledge, and identity within families. Elders who might have taught children about their ancestry, traditions, or even survival skills were often taken away, leaving the younger generation with gaps in memory and history. One entry recounts a mother being sold just after teaching her daughter a cherished song tied to the family's heritage. The diarist notes how, despite her absence, the daughter remembered the tune perfectly, but without guidance, much of its meaning was lost. These small cultural ruptures compounded over time, weakening the sense of continuity and connection between generations. In addition, the diary highlights the economic and social consequences of these separations. Families who were split up often lost the support networks that made survival more manageable. A father sold to a distant plantation could no longer protect his wife or children from the whims of overseers, leaving them more vulnerable to exploitation. Children sent far away often had to adapt quickly to unfamiliar work conditions, climates, and overseers, creating a fractured sense of self and identity. The diarist frequently remarks on the strain this placed on family cohesion, noting that some individuals who survived repeated separations became withdrawn or mistrustful, shaping the dynamics of households for decades. The psychological consequences were equally severe. The diary records that parents and children experienced persistent anxiety, depression, and grief that could last a lifetime. One mother, whose entire family was gradually sold off, reportedly spent years wandering the plantation grounds at night, calling for the children she would never see again. Older siblings who had survived multiple sales often struggled to form attachments, fearing the inevitability of loss. These patterns of emotional distress became intergenerational, influencing the upbringing of subsequent children and creating cycles of fear, hypervigilance, and sadness that historians recognize as the long-term trauma of slavery. The diary also shows how these separations affected community bonds. Families were often scattered across plantations hundreds of miles apart, making reunions rare and unreliable. The diarist records letters and visits that attempted to reconnect family members, but these were few and far between. Some families adapted by forming surrogate bonds with neighbors or extended kin, creating new networks of care. But these were never complete replacements for the lost family structures. The result was a patchwork of relationships that, while resilient, could not erase the deep ache of permanent separation. Education and skills transmission were also deeply impacted. Enslaved parents who were sold could no longer teach their children how to read, write, or learn the trades necessary for survival. The diarist notes that children raised apart from their parents often lacked guidance in both practical and cultural knowledge, leaving them ill, prepared to navigate plantation life and later society. Even the small acts of cultural preservation, songs, stories, prayers, and customs, were disrupted, weakening the transmission of heritage that might have helped bind generations together. Finally, the diary underscores the legacy of these separations in the post-emancipation era. Families that had been torn apart often struggled to reconnect, if they could at all. The diarist hints at a lingering sense of dislocation, with adult children searching for parents or siblings they had not seen in decades, often encountering only partial traces of their families. This fractured sense of identity, the diary suggests, became a silent inheritance passed down through generations, a constant reminder of the human cost of a system that treated people as property and ignored the sanctity of family. In essence, the diary doesn't merely document acts of cruelty, it reveals the enduring consequences of those acts on families, communities, and generations. It shows how the separation of loved ones created ripples that affected emotional health, cultural continuity, social cohesion, and identity itself. Even as decades passed and the immediate horrors of slavery faded into history, the echoes of those separations lived on, a haunting testament to the resilience and suffering of those whose lives were forever altered by the brutal decisions of plantation owners.